Mark, welcome back to our third episode of crime during the Second World War. And for this part, we are covering the Americans, and we've entitled it The Yanks Are Coming. And as my father's grandmother always used to say, they are oversexed and over here. So I hope I haven't stolen your thunder there. That will certainly come up, I think. But
You certainly have, but I'm still going to repeat it later on.
but in the first part, we covered sort of general crime, really, murder, burglary, vice, that kind of thing. And then in the second part, we covered the gangs of London, and that involved all sorts of rather unsavory characters. And now, third, we have with the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 41, the Americans then head to our shores, Mark. And whilst they did bring an overwhelming, powerful fighting force, they also brought with them a few problems, it's probably fair to say. So, Mark, I'm very much looking forward to hearing what sort of American crime arrived on these shores, along with the other delights that they would have brought. So why don't we kick off?
Absolutely, Ollie. And I'm happy to be on here again. And yes, I'm going to be talking about American criminal activity during the war after well over 1 million people, soldiers, flooded into Britain, American soldiers, after Pearl Harbor and the US's entry into the war. But before getting down to specifics as regards American-related crime, I think it might be useful to touch on the American arrival and the huge impact it had on British society at large. At its numerical peak in June 1944, the US military had over 1.5 million servicemen in Britain, and in total, 2 million American troops passed through the country during the war. In many rural parts of the country, US troops often outnumbered locals. In London, GIs swarmed through central London. George Orwell commented in 1943, "It is difficult to go anywhere in London without having the feeling that Britain is now occupied territory." Another observer said, "There is not a single square inch of London on which an American is not standing, and if he is standing after dark, he is standing unsteadily." And in particularly popular American enclaves like Piccadilly, Grosvenor Square, and Mayfair, as the war went on, people said it became something of a surprise to actually encounter an Englishman at all, especially at night. To focus for a moment on how the American presence in Britain grew, the first American contingent landed in Belfast in January 1942. Further shipping convoys deposited troops in ports like Liverpool, Southampton, and Glasgow. Growth was slow but steady initially. By the end of May 1943, there were 133,000 US military personnel scattered all over the country. Thereafter, the numbers grew rapidly. By December 1943, there were over 500,000, and by May 1944, just before D-Day, the figure was 1.65 million. Camps and air bases were needed, as were buildings for administrative and other purposes. By the latter stages of the war, the US military authorities had the use of more than 300 buildings in London for administrative use or for accommodation. This included 24 or more hotels used exclusively as American officer billets. East Anglia was an area much populated by American forces, particularly by US Bomber Command. Given its flat terrain and proximity to Germany, it was the natural location for both British and American air bases. The United States Army Air Force, there was no distinct US Air Force until after the war, took over from the RAF or built from scratch over 200 air bases across Britain. Over half of these bases were in East Anglia. At the height of the war, the US AAF had over 500,000 personnel, 200,000 of whom were in East Anglia. Each airbase would generally house between 2,000 and 2,500 men. Most of the boat bases were located near small towns or villages, and the new American population would dwarf that of the locals. Inevitably, the impact of these bases on ordinary life in such places was huge. The arrival of the Americans had a particularly powerful impact on the women of Britain. In bleak, bombed out and rationed Britain, the appearance of American GIs provided a major boost to the female population. Compared with the British local male population, the Americans were generally fitter, healthier, better dressed, and better off. They were also more mysterious and often very adept at charming the local girls. As one Birmingham teenager said, "We were half-starved and drably dressed, but the GIs said we looked good anyway." Another young woman said, "A British soldier would take a girl for a drink and bore her to death talking about cars or sports. Then if he saw any of his mates, he abandoned the girl until it was time to go. With the GI, it was different. He would buy me a drink and entertain me as if I was the only person in the room." Not sure if things have changed much there, Ollie, I don't know. Then there was the vast difference in relative pay between American and British soldiers. A British soldier was paid 14 shillings a week, which is equivalent to 70p now, but in real today's money, £28. His American equivalent was paid £3.8 and 9 pence, or roughly £138 in today's value. Along with that huge salary difference, the GIs were serving on an all-found basis. In other words, all their food and lodging was free. Then again, the American bases had copious supplies of items which were scarce or not available at all to the locals. Things like chocolate, cigarettes, soap, and so on. Another advantage the GIs held over British men when trying to impress British women. I should mention here that, perhaps unsurprisingly, the British officer class made sure to look after themselves. Unlike their squaddies, their salaries were almost on a par with those of their American counterparts. So from the green young country girls in the villages of East Anglia to their likely more worldly counterparts in the big towns and cities, a GI boyfriend was a much sought-after item. In London, girls swarmed outside places known to attract large contingents of GIs. Chief among these places was Rainbow Corner, the largest and most popular of the GI social clubs run by the American Red Cross in Britain. It was situated in Piccadilly on the corner of Shaftesbury Avenue on the site of Delmonico's, a very popular London restaurant before the war. Apart from offering GIs a meal and a bed for the night, there were dances, concerts, quizzes, many other forms of recreation. Bicycles were also available for those wishing to tour the capital. Another central London American gathering point was the Grosvenor House Hotel, although this was for officers only. In the early days of the war, the hotel served as a Sunday club for American officers, but in 1943, it became the officers' main London mess. The restaurant in the hotel's great room is estimated to have served over 300,000 officers and their guests during the war. At its peak, the mess, nicknamed Willow Run after the famed vehicle assembly line at the Ford Motor Company plant in Detroit, served over 14,000 meals a day. The hotel, sandbagged and walled about in concrete, never closed its doors for 1 hour, day or night, during the 2,074 days of World War II. The numerous pubs, clubs, restaurants, and spielers of Soho and the West End were also, of course, magnets to the GIs. Grosvenor Square, where the US Embassy and chief military administrative officers were located, was also a very popular American hangout. And then there was Mayfair, home to a good proportion of London's ladies of the night. Girls working this area and other parts of central London had two common nicknames, the Piccadilly Commandos and the Hyde Park Rangers. As discussed in the second podcast of this series, the main London vice gang was operated by the Messina brothers, and they ran most of their many prostitutes in the Mayfair area. In recognition of their much better wages, American GIs had to pay much more for the services of these ladies than did British soldiers. American soldier relations with British women, whether professional or not, didn't of course always run smoothly, as you'll hear when I move on to discuss the bad trouble some Americans got into. When the American troops arrived in Britain, they transported with them one of their most intractable domestic problems, poor race relations. At the outset of American involvement in the war, there were some US politicians and senior military men who didn't want any black soldiers brought with the army to Britain at all. However, the decision was eventually made to bring them, and the numbers in which they were to go were aimed to replicate their proportion of the American population. 10% of the American population, of 132 million, were of African origin, and so the military target was for African Americans to constitute 10% of the forces sent overseas, and this was roughly what happened. At the time of the US's entry into the war, most military training took place in the southern states, and most of the Army's black recruits came from that part of the country. This is not surprising, as 80% of African Americans lived in these states at the time. Legalized racial segregation governed society in all the southern states of the former Confederacy. The governing laws, dubbed Jim Crow laws after a disrespectful show parodying an old black man dancing, were supposed to enshrine separate but equal treatment. In reality, as everyone knows, African Americans got separate but very unequal treatment. Public transport, schools, restaurants, parks, and cemeteries were all segregated. Mixed-race marriage was against the law in all southern states and in many others too. The war did provide an opportunity for many Black Americans to escape the oppressive conditions of the South. What became known as the Great Migration, beginning in 1940, saw millions of African Americans move north or west, where there was increasing factory work available as war production was cranked up. Roosevelt eased their path by enacting legislation outlawing discrimination in the war production industry. So this was the situation back in America when Black American soldiers started arriving in Britain. Senior US Army attitudes to their Black recruits mirrored those of the white civilian population back home. Of course, there were enlightened officers to be found, but they were in the minority. Black soldiers were usually given all the low-end jobs in American bases, cleaning the latrines, digging ditches, dishwashing, and other menial tasks. A good few of the Black recruits had college degrees, but they seldom received advancement in recognition of their abilities. As one Black soldier observed after the war, "We had white officers that didn't even finish high school, but the fact they were white was enough to guarantee them more senior positions than us." So, as back in America, Black soldiers were very much second-class citizens in the US Army. American white prejudice against Black soldiers manifested itself in many ways in wartime Britain. It was to be seen most clearly when GIs were off duty, seeking entertainment. The simple sight of Black soldiers sharing the same pubs and restaurants as them was anathema to many white American soldiers and frequently provoked violence. Even more provocative was the sight of Black soldiers dancing or socializing with white British girls, as often happened. While it could hardly be said that racial prejudice was unknown among the British population in this period, it was on nothing like the American scale, and British girls generally had little problem with being approached by Black soldiers. Indeed, some wartime surveys revealed that the Black American soldiers were regarded by many women as preferable to their white counterparts on account of their being politer and more considerate. As the war progressed, it is noteworthy that the discrimination and poor treatment meted out to Black soldiers by their countrymen became an increasingly sore point to many British people. Indeed, as I'll be discussing later, there were occasional public outcries, as in the case of Leroy Henry, when any particularly egregious example of discrimination became widely known. The British government's attitude to Black soldiers was not quite so commendable as that of the public, at least in the earlier days of the war. Initially, they were not keen at all on the idea of Black soldiers being part of the arriving American forces. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden is on record as suggesting to US Ambassador John Winant that the British climate is badly suited to the Blacks. Any British objections were firmly overruled by President Roosevelt, who insisted that Black recruits were to serve in all theaters of war. General Eisenhower had hoped at the outset to concentrate Black GIs in areas where the British Black population was located. This proved unrealistic. Apart from anything else, the British Black population at the time was tiny, at only 15,000 or so. As the war went by, some of the racial tensions among American recruits were relieved by the introduction in various parts of the country of Britain's own version of segregation. Many pubs, cinemas, dance halls, and even fish and chip shops began designating certain evenings as whites only or blacks only. The US military authorities also tried to manage the situation by alternating the leave days of white and Black soldiers. In Tewkesbury and Gloucestershire, for example, white troops were allowed a pass only on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, while Black troops were allowed Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. In a few instances, Black resentment of the way they were treated boiled over into serious violence. On one occasion in the town of Launceston in Cornwall, a whole company of Black soldiers, armed with rifles, opened fire on a number of white American military police in the town square. This event, which became known as the Mutiny in the Duchy, took place on a Sunday morning after various confrontations over the weekend when the police had been heavy-handed in clearing the Black soldiers out of dance halls and pubs. Though bullets flew, Luckily, no one died. 2 MPs were injured in the leg, which was taken as an indication that the black soldiers had purposely aimed low. Despite the minimal injuries, the court-martial that took place in Paignton Town Hall 3 weeks later drew huge public and press attention. The public, well aware by now of the generally shoddy treatment of blacks by the US military, sided with the black soldiers. 14 black soldiers stood in the dock charged with mutiny when the court-martial began on October the 15th, 1943. The presiding American officer, Colonel Raymond Zickel, conscious of the public interest and aware of the bad look of the courtroom, in that everyone in the room was white apart from the defendants, made a request that the journalists present make no reference to the color of the accused. While some complied, others, notably the Daily Mirror, did not. Notwithstanding public criticism, the trial that followed was notably one-sided in favor of the prosecution. Among other weaknesses in the case, there was no firm identification evidence against any of the accused. Nevertheless, all were found guilty and were shipped back to the US to serve sentences of 15 to 20 years hard labor. There were several other instances of US interracial violence in the run-up to D-Day, which the authorities did their best to cover up. A US Army memo in early 1944 observed, "Incidents of violence between the races have increased notably. The whites dislike the blacks and the blacks dislike the whites. The predominant note is that if the invasion doesn't occur soon, trouble will." The unjust treatment of black soldiers by the US legal system, as displayed in the Launceston mutiny case, was mirrored on a large scale elsewhere in the system. Now on to some specifics about wartime American crime. In August 1942, the British Parliament passed the Visiting Forces Act. This law was introduced after pressure from the Americans, who were not prepared to place their soldiers, sailors, and airmen under the jurisdiction of British courts. The US State, War, and Navy departments demanded exclusive American criminal jurisdiction over their forces in Britain, arguing that as theirs was a largely conscript army serving overseas, they were on duty all the time and should therefore only be regulated by military law. The British authorities were in no position to insist otherwise and duly complied. This new arrangement does not appear to have caused any particular waves among the British public. The British were grateful for the American presence, and if they wanted to run their own courts, so be it, was the general attitude. I should say here a few words about overall relations between GIs and the British people, which were generally very good throughout the war. From the outset of the Americans' presence in the UK, great efforts were made to ensure that this was the case. Booklets were made for both Americans and British to explain the particular quirks and habits of both nations. Tea versus coffee, warm beer versus cold beer, etc. A film was produced with Hollywood actor Burgess Meredith telling GIs how to go about visiting pubs and the like. The US Ambassador John Winant, who had taken over from the defeatist Joe Kennedy, earned the high respect of the British public for his efforts to bring people together and for his general behavior and demeanor during the war. He helped set up a British-American liaison board to investigate and try and settle Anglo-American disputes. The Women's Voluntary Service ran British welcome clubs, which welcomed GIs to Britain with tea, buns, and conversation. And many British families opened their doors to GIs and introduced them to the virtues of the Great British Sunday Lunch. Of course, there were irritations and resentments. The Americans were, as Ollie mentioned, famously overfed, overpaid, oversexed, and overheard. And many a British civilian or squaddy was unamused by the Americans' success with their women. But overall, the two different nationalities rubbed along okay. So, going back to the subject, the Visiting Forces Act, ordinary people had little problem with it. But what about the British police, who saw their powers circumscribed by the Act? The answer is that there were a few initial difficulties when jurisdiction, in some cases, had to be switched mid-investigation. In my fifth Frank Merlin novel, Dead in the Water, I imagined such a situation in the summer of 1942, in which Merlin is unhappy to have a case taken off him, and they're more unhappy to see the case badly mishandled by the American military police. However, such difficulties were generally short-lived. One must remember how pressed the British police generally, and particularly in London, were during the war. With many policemen having joined the services, they were undermanned in terms of experienced officers. And the war had added significantly to their workload, with things like the black market, looting, blackout regulations, and more to police at the same time as they were facing a general crime boom. Thus, most officers probably grew to appreciate the easing of some pressure afforded by the Visiting Forces Act. So, in the summer of 1942, as the US military had been allowed by the Act jurisdiction over all crimes alleged against American soldiers, courts and correctional facilities were urgently required. In London, a principal US courtroom was established in a building near the US Embassy in Grosvenor Square. Elsewhere in the country, use was made of local police courts, town halls, local government facilities, or whatever else might serve. Albeit that they were mostly dealing with ordinary crimes, the courtrooms had a distinctly military look. Most counsel were military officers, although British lawyers were allowed to appear. If they did, there were no wigs and gowns. A large American flag was always pinned up on the wall to remind people the court was, for the moment at least, American territory. So next, on to correctional facilities used by the Americans. All American bases, of course, had their own guardhouses and lockups, which were made full use of. London had its own main guardhouse, known as Central District, which was on the Tottenham Court Road. The main prison facility used by the Americans during the war was, however, quite away from London. Shepton Mallet Prison in Somerset had been a prison since the early 17th century. In the summer of 1942, just after the Visiting Forces Act was passed, the British authorities handed it over to the US military for their exclusive use for the duration. Initially, the Americans designated it as 6883 Guardhouse Overhead Detachment, then the headquarters 2912 Disciplinary Training Center. Throughout their occupation of the prison, it was entirely staffed by American personnel, with one notable exception. The hangmen who presided over the 18 executions carried out at Shepton Mallet were always British, for reasons I'll explain shortly. So, there had been a prison at Shepton Mallet for over 300 years. It was established in 1625 as one of the first English prisons pursuant to a law of James I's time, requiring every English county to have its own House of Correction. During the famous bloody assizes of Judge Jeffreys following the Monmouth Rebellion of 1685, at least 12 men were imprisoned at Shepton Mallet before being hung, drawn and quartered in the town's Market Square. For much of its earlier history, the prison was known for its terrible conditions. At the beginning of the 19th century, it held about 200 prisoners, men, women and children. In 1823, a large treadwheel was installed by William Cubitt, the renowned engineer. Men sentenced to hard labor would go on the wheel for many hours at a time, powering a grain mill located just outside the prison wall. The 19th century saw a steady decline in prisoners, such that by 1897, the prison population was only 61. By 1930, this figure had further reduced to 51, and the prison was closed down for underuse until 1939, when it was reopened for the British military. Prior to the American takeover, as well as housing over 300 British military offenders, the prison was used to house various important historical documents transferred from London to protect them from German bombs. Among the items stored were the Doomsday Book, HMS Victory's logbooks from Trafalgar, and dispatches from the Battle of Waterloo. So, in late 1942, the American military authorities had their own courtrooms and prisons to use in the exercise of their newly granted legal jurisdiction. What crimes did American military men commit? Well, as you can imagine, they ran the full gamut, but let's kick off with the most serious ones. First off, probably the most notorious of the wartime crimes committed by American soldiers. It is an anomalous tale, anomalous insofar as it is the only serious crime for which, after pressure from the British for reasons I'll explain, the Americans waived their right to American jurisdiction and allowed the man in question to be tried in a British court. The case in question arose in 1944. Carl Hulton was a young US Army deserter who hooked up with one Elizabeth Jones, a Welsh good time girl. The crime was murder. This case is often known as the cleft chin murder, as that was the victim's main distinguishing feature. It is also remembered as the case of Chicago Joe and Blondie, or Chicago Joe and the Showgirl, which was the title given to the Hollywood movie made about the case in 1990. That film starred Kiefer Sutherland and Emily Lloyd as the murderous couple. The case was also the subject of an Orson Welles radio play and a George Orwell essay. So who were these two young people? Carl Hulton was a Swedish-born GI whose mother had emigrated to the US when he was a child. He grew up in Massachusetts and after working in various menial jobs, enlisted in the army soon after Pearl Harbor. Although still not 20, he already had a young child. Elizabeth Jones, née Barker, was from Neath in South Wales. Born in 1926, she was an unruly child and spent time in an approved school. When she got out of the school, at the age of 16, she married an older man called Stanley Jones. Within a day or two of the marriage, she decided it was not for her and hopped it to London. In London, she had a number of jobs, including being a waitress, barmaid, cinema usherette, and stripper. She had delusions of grandeur and was prone to fantasies. When she met Hulton, at which point she was still only 18, she was going under the name Georgina Grayson, which she thought gave her a bit of class. Before the couple hooked up, Private Hulton had decided that invading France was not for him and had deserted. When he'd left his camp, he'd stolen a 2.5-ton truck, which amazingly he used as his transport for many weeks, filling up petrol when needed at American bases without challenge. Hulton and Jones met in the Black and White Cafe on Hammersmith Broadway on October the 3rd, 1944. Jones was with a male friend who knew Hulton as Lieutenant Ricky Allen of the US Army and introduced him to Jones. Hulton was wearing a stolen officer's uniform and looked the part. As well as claiming to be an officer, he told Jones he was a gangster and a member of the Chicago mob. One of Jones's particular fantasies was to be a gangster's mole. The pair hit it off immediately. They arranged to meet again, on which occasion they went for a spin in Hulton's truck and headed westward out of London towards Reading. Somewhere along the way, Hulton revealed to Jones he wasn't an officer. This didn't put Jones off, and she shared her gangster's mole fantasy with him. They decided to try and have some daring adventures. Hulton also revealed that he was carrying a gun, which greatly excited Jones. The first of their adventures, a modest one, came on this journey out of London. Hulton stopped the truck and pushed a passing girl off her bicycle. The girl ran off, leaving a handbag, which had only a few coins and clothing coupons in it. The following evening, they met again to go to the pictures. Afterwards, they went for another spin. They headed westwards again with the vague intent of robbing a pub. Nothing came of this, but a couple of days later, they picked up a young female hitchhiker whom they assaulted and robbed. The hitchhiker happily survived. After another adventure, in which they had failed in their attempt to rob a taxi driver, on Friday, October the 6th, they tried again. At 11 p.m., they hailed a cab in Hammersmith and asked the driver to take them to the West London suburb of Staines. The cleft-chinned driver, George Heath, said he couldn't take them that far, but offered to drop them at the Chiswick roundabout, an offer they accepted. When Heath pulled over at the roundabout, Hulton shot the driver in the back. The bullet smashed through Heath's spine and paralysed him. Hulton pushed the driver into the passenger seat and drove off towards Staines. On the way, he searched Heath, finding £8 in cash, a watch, and a few other small items of value. But then at some point on the drive, Heath died. When they got to Staines, Hulton pulled Heath out of the car and threw his body into a ditch. It didn't take long for the police to track the couple down. Finding Heath's taxi a much more comfortable drive than his truck, he foolishly drove it around over the weekend rather than dumping it. When Heath's body was found and identified, the police were naturally on the lookout for his taxi. The registration number was soon spotted by an observant policeman, and by Monday, October the 9th, the couple were in police custody. The reason the British police wanted Hulton to be tried in a British court rather than an American one, because they wanted to charge both Hulton and Jones of murder on the basis that it had been a joint enterprise. And if they did this, separate trials were impossible. Ambassador Winant reluctantly acquiesced, and the two were put on trial at the Old Bailey. When the trial took place in January 1945, the couple inevitably tried to cast all blame on the other. Regardless, the jury convicted both of murder, although they recommended mercy for Jones. Nevertheless, Mr. Justice Charles donned the traditional black cap and condemned both to death. Subsequent appeals in February were rejected, and then the question of whether there would be any reprieve from hanging lay in the hands of the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison. An execution date of March the 8th had been set. Ambassador Winant argued strongly that if the American were to hang, so should Jones. In the end, despite Winant's protests, Jones alone was reprieved by Morrison 48 hours before the executions were due. Reprieve was issued on the basis she would serve a life sentence instead. On the morning of March the 8th, Hulton was duly hanged in Pentonville Prison. He was 5 days from his 23rd birthday. He had one of the same British executioners who would have hanged him had the execution taken place at Shepton Mallet. Jones was eventually released in 1954 after serving 9 years. She then sold her story to a Sunday newspaper. What happened to her thereafter is unknown. So what other serious criminal activity did American soldiers get up to in World War II? I mentioned earlier that 18 Americans were executed at Shepton Mallet during the war, and I'll come to some of their crimes of violence in a moment. But there was plenty of American involvement in serious non-violent crimes too. For example, many GIs got involved in the British home front black market. As mentioned before, American bases had copious supplies of items which were strictly rationed or simply unavailable to the home population: food, drink, cigarettes, petrol, etc. Inevitably, some unscrupulous GIs could not resist helping themselves to some of these items and flogging them for good money outside the bases. Some also involved themselves in more organised rackets in partnership with British gangs. Deserters were naturally drawn to crime, as this was likely to be the only way they could support themselves. Carl Hulton was only one of many such. During the war, the US military lost over 40,000 men to desertion in Britain. Of these, 21,000 were caught and court-martialed, and 49 were sentenced to death. In only one case, however, was a desertion death sentence carried out. Occasionally, there were combined American-British operations to catch deserters. Just after the end of the war in Europe, 2,000 uniformed police, CID men, and American, Canadian, and British police took part in the biggest such raid ever in London. This was in 1945. The West End was completely sealed off, and the police went on the hunt for the approximately 20,000 deserters of all nationalities still at large. They were not very successful. As British crime gang kingpin Billy Hill observed scoffingly, and I won't attempt a Cockney accent here, they questioned every living soul they saw within the boundaries of Mayfair and Soho. They checked thousands upon thousands of service passes and ID cards. I think they may have tumbled half a dozen deserters. ID cards, passes, they were pieces of paper we could print for anyone, any day we liked, which all goes to show how organised we were and handicapped with the law in trying to fix us. Now, going back to crimes of violence. In 2006, long after the war, the Home Office finally released secret files giving figures on crimes of violence committed in Britain by American GIs. Figures revealed that there were 26 murders, 31 manslaughters, 22 attempted murders, and over 400 sexual offences, including 126 rapes. It should be noted that under American jurisdiction, rape was a capital offence. It was not in British law and hadn't been since 1841. The GIs who paid the ultimate price for their crimes, that is, the 18 executed at Shepton Mallet, I'll give you the details of those now. 9 of those executions were for murder, 6 for rape, and 3 for both of these crimes. 16 of the executions were by hanging and 2 by firing squad. Reflecting the colour bias in the wartime US military, the great majority of those executed were not white. 10 were black, 3 Hispanic, and 5 white. The British authorities were not initially happy with the idea of the Americans carrying out their own executions on British soil. The Americans insisted, however, saying if the condemned men were returned far away to the US for punishment, soldiers on the ground might believe the executions had not been carried out, and that would be bad for discipline. The British relented, but in return insisted the hangman be British, not American. Their reason for this was that they believed they developed a more humane method of hanging than was in common use in the US, and did not trust the Americans to use their method. Without going into too much gruesome detail, the issue was that of whether the victim died swiftly and humanely by the breaking of the neck, or at length by strangulation. The Americans protested against this British insistence and went ahead and shipped over their own hangman, but eventually conceded the point. All Shepton Mallet hangings were carried out by Albert and or Thomas Pierpoint, members of the infamous family of executioners who presided over British hangings for over half a century. The first American hanging at Shepton Mallet took place in March 1943. The victim was David Cobb. The 20-year-old son of a black clergyman in Alabama, Cobb was a young man who did not take to military life and was often in trouble. However, the trouble was never major until an incident in December 1942. Assigned to night duty on guard at his Northamptonshire barracks, he was not relieved at the due hour. 4 hours passed until an officer, Lieutenant Cobner, visited his post. Cobb complained to the lieutenant, said he was going off duty immediately, whether relieved or not. Cobb was carrying a rifle, and the officer tried to take it off him. Cobb resisted, and the gun went off. The lieutenant fell down dead. Cobb was swiftly convicted of murder, was hanged by Thomas Pierpoint on the 12th of March, 1943. A particularly vicious crime was that of 22-year-old Private Lee Davis, another black soldier stationed in Wiltshire. On the evening of the 29th of March, 1943, two young hospital workers, June Lay and Muriel Forden, bumped into each other after watching a film in the town of Marlborough. They both lived at the nearby Savernake Hospital and set out there together. As they approached the hospital on a country road, they were confronted by Davis, who was carrying a rifle. Davis told them to stand still, then enter a field next to the road. It was clear to both women that he intended them harm. June Lay shouted to her friend that they should make a run for it and head off down the road. Davis aimed his rifle and shot her twice in the back, killing her. Then he dragged Muriel Forden into the field and raped her twice. Afterwards, fearing she would be murdered too, Muriel entered into conversation with Davis and told him that as a Christian she would forgive him his actions. Then, as if nothing had happened, he escorted her politely to the hospital. Davis was easily tracked down and convicted. He was hanged at Shepton Mallet on the 14th of December, 1943. The dubious honour of being the first man hanged for rape in Britain since the early 19th century was Private Madison Thomas, another black soldier, this time stationed in Cornwall. His victim was a middle-aged widow called Beatrice Reynolds. As she was walking home for a British Legion meeting in her Cornish village, Thomas attacked her in a field. He raped and severely injured Mrs. Reynolds, but she survived. Thomas hanged on the 12th of October, 1944. There is, of course, no excusing the vile crimes committed by these young black soldiers. However, the racial bias in the system meant that a black soldier was much more likely to be sentenced to death for serious crimes than was a white. One white soldier who proved an exception was William Anderson, a 22-year-old Ohio native who committed a heinous crime in Northern Ireland in September of 1944. Anderson was a troublemaker. By the time of his crime, he'd been court-martialed several times. He had been serving a sentence of hard labor in a Northern Ireland military prison when he was released early and decided to go on a celebratory drinking binge. At some point, he was in a pub in a village where he knew some locals. He owed one of these some money, decided to take a break from his binge and go to see the man and repay him. This he did, and then offered to help the man and his family by going to the village shop to pick up some provisions for them. He also offered to take Patsy, the family's 7-year-old daughter, to the shop with him to buy her sweets, and the family agreed. She was never seen again, alive. She was never seen alive again. Harrison never went to the shop, but instead went to a nearby field where he raped and strangled a little girl. He left the body under some hay, but it was quickly discovered, and Harrison was arrested. The issue at his court-martial was not whether he'd done it, as he'd freely admitted to the crime, but whether his mental state was such that he could plead diminished responsibility. The court dismissed the argument of diminished responsibility, and he was hanged on the 7th of April, 1945. The details of the other GIs executed at Shepton Mallet, nearly all in their early 20s, are John Waters, hanged for the murder of his English girlfriend in Henley. John Leatherbury, hanged for the murder of a taxi driver in Essex. Willie Harris, hanged for stabbing to death a pimp in Belfast. Alex Miranda, death by firing squad for shooting his sergeant in their Devon base. Elijah Brinnon and Willie Smith, hanged together for raping a woman in a Gloucestershire field. Benjamin Pygate, shot by firing squad for killing a fellow soldier at their Wiltshire camp. Ernest Clark and Augustine Guerra, hanged together for the murder and rape of a 15-year-old girl in Kent. Robert Pearson and Parson Jones, hanged for raping a pregnant woman in Somerset. George Smith, hanged for killing a rich landowner when caught poaching and trespassing on the landowner's Norfolk estate. Aniceto Martinez, hanged for raping a 75-year-old woman in Staffordshire. He was the last person to be hanged in Britain for the crime of rape. As regards the men executed by firing squad, The exact reasons for the use of that method are unclear. It has been suggested it was because they both killed fellow soldiers on military bases, but so had David Cobb, the first person to be executed at Shepton Mallet, and he was hanged. I should mention that the British insistence on using only British executioners did not run to the firing squads, which were made up of only American soldiers. Only one man held in Shepton Mallet awaiting an appointment with the hangman was lucky enough to escape that appointment. This was Corporal Leroy Henry, whose name I mentioned earlier. Henry was convicted at court-martial of the rape of a woman in Bath in May 1944 and was sentenced to death. There were, however, stories circulating locally that the victim, Irene Lilly, had been engaged in casual prostitution. Lilly was said to make herself available to soldiers for £1 or 2. It was thought that Lilly had maliciously reported the incident as rape because of an argument about money. A local campaign was got up in favour of Leroy Henry. People sympathised with him as a black soldier who'd been given a raw deal by the American authorities because of the colour of his skin. The local press in Bath came out in vociferous support of Henry, and 33,000 people signed a petition calling for his reprieve. All this was happening in the run-up to D-Day, and General Eisenhower decided this was a distraction the military could do without. He ordered a quick review, which was scathing about the prosecution case, then granted Henry a reprieve, and ordered that he be freed from Shepton Mallet and returned to his unit without a stain on his character. So there you have a snapshot of American crime in World War II Britain. I'll wrap up this podcast with a tale of one more execution of an American, although he's seldom recognised as such. William Joyce was an American-born man of Irish stock. After moving in his youth from New York to Ireland, he went on to England, where in the 1930s he became a member of Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. Just before the war, he moved to Germany and became a radio announcer. He soon became very well known in Britain by the nickname Lord Haw-Haw. Joyce broadcast from Berlin a regular program of German propaganda on Germany's English service. It was much listened to. My own grandmother told me that she and the family always made a point of listening to it so they could have a good laugh. Just as the war ended, Joyce was arrested in northern Germany. At some point while living in England, he'd acquired a British passport. He was thus now eligible to be tried for treason. He was so tried and convicted and sentenced to death. In common with his fellow Americans at Shepton Mallet, it was a Pierpoint who manned the gallows.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.